What was that filthy thing doing? Welcome back to the Budget Archive. My name is Mitch, and today we're rummaging in the trash. I'm absolutely loving Norm decks at the moment. I don't know why. So we had Tony last week, and this week we're bringing you an Allen deck. This isn't just any Allen deck though, it's Allen Raccoons. Raccoons are probably one of the best archetypes to come out in RDO, not because they're competitively viable, but just because they're so much fun. The whole way they work together and support each other to buff their damage up as well as keep your opponent's graveyard empty is just amazing. It's something we haven't really seen in the game in terms of archetype synergies before. Yes, there's been like all the automaton synergies and such, but quite often those cards work better on their own than they do in the whole format of the deck. Whereas these cards absolutely suck if they aren't together. So these are definitely made for this deck. Starting us off, we've got Spirit of Purity. This is probably the perfect spirit for this deck. Not only is it a norm spirit, so your opponent can't use any baubles early on in order to get any advantage, but also it has the lineage release of each player banishes 2 cards from their graveyard. So once you go up into Sylvie level 1 here, then you'll be in a position to be able to banish this, force your opponent to get cards out of their graveyard, which is the whole point of this deck with all the Raccoons wanting to clear their graveyard to get buffs. And quite often if your opponent does something in response to you attacking with a buffed Raccoon in order to fill their graveyard with something to stop the Raccoons from giving buffs, then this could be a perfect opportunity to lineage release this, banish whatever they put into their graveyard straight away, keeping their attack with the buff without having to play anything out of hand. Sylvie Wild's Whisperer. As the on-enter of the next animal beast LIU activates turn, enters with additional buff counter on it. Every unit in this deck pretty much is an animal. The only thing that isn't Bedivere is an animal, but it's also human, so it won't get a couple of the bonus effects that we talk about a little bit later on. The main unit for this deck is Allen Beast Beckoner. As the on-enter of Glimpse 3, then reveal the top card of your deck. If it's a Harmony or Melody, put it into your hand. So in this deck, the main Harmony or Melodies are going to be Blissful Cooling and Song of Nurturing down here. Most of the time this effect isn't going to do too much, it's just going to effectively allow you to possibly go +1 on a card, as well as have a card either protect or search for more Raccoons. The main thing here is as long as you control 2 or more allies, or animals or beast allies, it gets +2. So with this, the main unit this is going to care about in the deck is Bedivere, because it has the class bonus and level 3+ bonus on death, put a buff counter on each animal or beast ally you control. When you've got this on the board with like 3 or 4 Raccoons, they're going to have to kill this before they kill the Raccoons with attacks. And in doing so, they're going to be giving you effectively 3 or 4 extra damage with those Raccoons and making them a lot harder to kill. Beastborn Boots. Banish it, your champion gains Spell Shroud, can only activate if you control an animal beast. With every unit in this deck being an animal, of course, we're going to always be able to activate this unless they clear your board. So it's one thing you have to be careful of. If they're going to try and clear your board with you knowing that once your board's clear, they're going to go for a spell kill, you may want to crack this prior to your board being completely cleared. Beastborn Ears, your champion gets +1 level as long as you control an animal or beast ally. This isn't necessarily needed in this deck because the only thing that really cares about it is Bedivere. However, the main thing with this is that because Bedivere is a level 3+ and Allen is level 2+ if you control 2 animal or beasts, if you only have one other animal and Bedivere dies, the on-death effect will check the current state of the field, and because you no longer have 2 animal or beasts on the field, you will not get this. So having Beastborn Ears on the field with another animal out will give you that level 3 with Allen on the board anyway, so you'll still get that extra buff counter. It's not going to come into effect too often, but it is one of those ones that you have to keep an eye out for. Floatal Trinket, probably one of the best Regalia in the deck. The 1 cost, that on enter, scavenge 6 for a Raccoon ally card. Scavenge is effectively a new mechanic in this set where you reveal cards from the top of your deck until you hit the specified type of card, and then put that card into your hand. It also has a class bonus of as long as your opponent has no cards in their graveyard, Raccoon allies get +1 attack. Now of course this whole deck is going to be about getting rid of the cards in your opponent's graveyard and not letting them have anything in there. So quite often this is going to be an active effect and can result in some massive damage on turns when we mix with things like Banner Raccoon up here. Safeguard Amulet, good prevention for non-attack damage. Terrafering, fooling your opponent, making them pay for each attack. Primal Whip. This is one of those Regalia where I believe the other Sylvie deck I saw do well on the online regional, online scene between season comp was running sort of Seeking, which I believe it was just a one attack sword with 2 durability, so it could just get the attacks in for Inspiring Call over here in order to activate this easily. However, Primal Whip being a 1 cost, yes, you don't want to have to banish stuff to bring it out, but often in this deck you will see with the amount of looping we do and protecting our units and drawing cards that quite often we can have a little bit extra influence in order to be able to bring this out. And it has the effect of class bonus and level 2 bonus of on attack up to 2 target non-human allies get +1 between turn. So this effectively turns into a 3 attack weapon that splits that attack amongst different units. And because the only unit in this deck that's not going to get this effect is Bedivere, it's definitely one that we want to look at being able to use. On top of that, with it being a level 2 plus bonus, this is where the Beastborn Ears can come into effect when you're on Sylvie level 1, because that means that you're effectively going to have the level 1 here, +1 for Beastborn Ears, giving you that level 2 total in order to get this on attack early in the game, rather than having to wait for you to go to Ellen before you can use this. We then have all 3 bubbles, Fire Bubble, Water Bubble, and Wind Bubble. If you're watching any of my other videos, you know I love the bubbles. The draw power they give you is just absolutely amazing into pretty much every deck in the meta. The only thing you're not going to get this in is either Norm decks and Slime decks. However, it's one of those ones where these are perfect things to have, and we'll look at the sideboard soon to see what we're going to bring in to take the 2 bubbles that we don't need out. So starting off the main deck, I'm going to go through our Raccoons first, and then I'll go back to the support cards. So the main Raccoon in this deck is Bandit Gaze Leader. This is a 3-drop 1/3 that has on enter scavenge 6 for a Raccoon ally card. So not only are you getting a 1/3 ally on the board, you're also able to then replace it in your hand with another ally. And it also gives Raccoon allies you control have tap it, banish target card in a graveyard. So effectively what this allows you to do is not only give itself this effect but all your other Raccoons. So if you are in a position where your opponent's got a few cards in the graveyard and you're not able to get those massive attacks through with things like Banner Raccoon, as we'll see in a second, then it gives all your Raccoons this effect, allowing you to then start chipping away at your opponent's graveyard and get rid of that graveyard before you start going for the mass damage. Banner Raccoon, one of the greatest Raccoons they've ever made. As long as your opponent has no cards in their graveyard, other Raccoons get +1. There's no level requirement, no class bonus requirement. Just as long as your opponent has nothing in the graveyard, you're going to be buffing all your other Raccoons. So, Bandit Gaze Leader along with Bandit Raccoon just means that you're constantly going to have your opponent's graveyard empty, allowing your Raccoons to attack for multiple damage a turn. However, the thing to note here is it is a 1/2. Yes, it only costs 2, but it's a 1/2, so it's easy to kill. That's where things like Bedivere here come into effect in order to protect it, and then some of the other cards in this deck will be specifically around trying to protect your Banner Raccoons mainly. We then have Buddy Raccoon. This is a 2-drop 1/2 again. As we'll notice throughout this video, the Raccoons are all pretty weak, hence why we need a lot of protection for them, as well as ways to give them buff counters in order to survive a bit longer. It has class bonus fast activation. We're going to be going up in Sylvie level 1 pretty quickly in this deck. You're quite often going to have this effect. And it also has on enter, you may return another target Raccoon ally you control to its owner's hand. There are multiple good targets for this in this deck. One of the good targets for it is definitely Bandit Gaze Leader, because you're not only going to have the effect of this on enter from from Buddy Raccoon. So effectively, when you play this down, the on enter will go on the stack. You can then tap it in response to the on enter with this effect, then bounce the Bandit Raccoon, Bandit Gaze Leader, then allowing you to play it down again and scavenge 6 again to then refill your hand with more Raccoons. We then have Excitable Raccoon. As long as your opponent has no cards in their graveyard, it gets +1 and has Vigor. So not quite as good as Banner Raccoon, doesn't give it to all your units. However, it does give it to itself, so it ends up as a 2/2 with Vigor. Although Vigor isn't necessarily something that's always going to come into effect, especially when you have a Bandit Gaze Leader on the field, it is a good thing to be able to have because you're going to be attacking for 2, maybe 3 if you have a banner raccoon on the field, allowing you to do some damage to your opponent, in a turn wake it up, and then if your opponent plays something during their turn in order to put something in the graveyard, it's then a wake in order to tap it, remove that card from the graveyard, so going into your next turn you're then going to be able to attack with it without having to worry about them having stuff in their graveyard. Then have Portly Raccoon, the best and the fattest. On enter, you may reveal 2 Raccoon cards from your hand and or memory. When you do, target opponent bashes a card from their graveyard. Now being a 3-drop 2/3 shouldn't be understated in this deck. Of course, 3-drop 2/3 is kind of your standard ally that you want to have in a deck. It's your standard baseline where your opponent's not going to be able to easily remove it, but it's still removable. However, being able to have the on-enter effect with it as well in order to get that graveyard down from your opponent and then have a 2/3 body, possibly a 3/4 if you've got some way to give it a buff counter. It's probably one of the better Raccoons in terms of staying on the board and dealing damage. We then have Protector Raccoon. Another, I don't really have any words for it. It's amazing. I love it. 2-drop, 1/2, fast activation, not class bonus locked, so you can just play Raccoon down on your first turn, hold this up in your hand, and get ready to protect it once your opponent goes to try kill it on turn 1. It's fast activation, of course, so tap it, prevent the next 2 damage to be dealt to target animal ally you control this turn. Everything in here is an animal, going to be protecting your whole board. It also has tap it, target opponent banishes the card from their graveyard. So quite often your opponent might go for a sneaky end of turn play on your end step in order to play a Creative Shock, discard a Floating Memory or something. Especially if you don't have Bandit Gaze Leader on the board, enabling you to fast speed remove stuff from their graveyard. So this is a perfect thing to be able to hold up, and then when they try to go back to their turn, then you can hold priority on end step, play this out, tap it, get rid of that Floating Memory or Limited Guide or whatever they just discarded, effectively stifling their game plan and forcing them to have to rethink what they want to do on their turn. And of course, Scavenging Raccoon. The original OG Raccoon has seen play in pretty much every meta. It's not necessarily played at the moment because there are better graveyard removal cards now. However, especially early on in the DOA and FTC meta, I played this in all my ally decks and it was absolutely amazing. It's a 2-drop 1/1, so not a great stat line, but still perfectly fine. On enter, banish up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard. This is probably one of the perfect Raccoons in this deck to be used alongside Buddy Raccoon, because it has the on enter, getting rid of 2 cards out of their graveyard, then you have Buddy Raccoon come down, bounce it back to your hand, and you can play it out again, effectively ending up getting rid of 4 cards in the graveyard. And if you have a Bandit Gaze Leader on the board, then that can often end up in situations where you're getting rid of 6 cards out of their graveyard in a single turn. Now, if they've got that many cards in their graveyard against you, you've done something wrong, because this deck is just an absolute beast at removing your opponent's graveyards. However, it is one of those ones that you can look at doing that little trick in order to get control of the game back if your opponent's managed to fill their graveyard up pretty fast. Now moving on to some of the support cards for the deck, we have Blissful Calling. This is a 1-cost slow speed of look at the top 5 cards of your deck. You may reveal an animal or beast card from among them, put it in your hand, put the rest on the bottom of the deck in any order. So, of course, with every ally in this deck being an animal, very, very rarely are you going to win. There are times when you might end up with just all your interactions staring at you. It does happen, but it's a very good card for this deck. One of the things to note with this is that you can put them on the bottom in any order. I would recommend, especially in a deck like this where you've got so many ways of scavenging the cards from the top of the deck and looking at the top of your deck, stacking it so you have the Raccoon that you want the most, or the card you want the most from that 4 cards on the bottom on the top furthest up in the deck, just so if you do manage to go through your deck, which you can easily do, then you're going to get to that card faster than if you were to just randomly do it. Dawn of Ashes. It wouldn't be a norm deck if we weren't running this. Now, I believe the other list I saw do well was only running 3. You could get away with running 3, however, I just think that it is one of those cards that you kind of want to guarantee getting it out early on in the game. Non-normal element cards cost 1 more to activate. It's effectively, that's the only effect on it. The upkeep's not going to matter because we've got all norm. Do be careful, you are going to have to reveal a card at the beginning of each recollection, so make sure that there's nothing there you want to keep hidden from your opponent. But yeah, slowing your opponent down in this deck, especially when you're removing any float or graveyard synergies they've got, is just another level of taxing them. This is definitely one of the cards that is probably a standout for all Norm decks, and I wouldn't run a Norm deck without it. We then have Forest Cake. It's a 2-drop item that has on air to draw a card. It also has class bonus of whenever an animal or beast ally enters the field under your control, you may sacrifice Forest Cake. If you do, put a buff counter on that ally. Now, pretty much any of the units in this deck are perfect to put a buff counter on. I'd probably say the best ones are probably Portly Raccoon because it becomes a 3-4 unit, and 4-butt units are pretty hard to remove. Also, Bedivere is another good target just because it becomes a 2-5, and being 5 toughness just makes it very hard for your opponent to remove it in one hit, effectively meaning you can be tanking an extra hit that your units or your face could have taken instead. We then have Inspiring Call. Now, I did mention that the other deck was running a Sword of Seeking, I believe it was. And this is one of the reasons why. I believe it was running maybe 3 or 4 copies of Inspiring Call. I'm not running as many because you're not going to be attacking as often in this deck as you might have in the other one. However, if you do attack, being able to give all your Raccoons another +1 damage, especially when you end up with 4 or 5 Raccoons on the board all buffing each other, ending up in situations where you can be dealing 4 or 5 damage with each Raccoon. Being able to play this just to buff everything again, replace itself in a deck like this can be hugely powerful. This is definitely one of those later game plays, especially after you've attacked with Primal Whip, giving the +1 damage to a couple different units as well. We then have Invective Instruction. This is target ally gets +3 until end of turn, and has a class bonus as if you control a non-human ally, draw a card into your memory. Now, of course, with the only ally being a human is Bedivere, quite often we're going to have a unit that's not a human. So you're going to be able to replace itself with this, as well as giving a unit an extra damage buff, which can be sometimes just the required damage in order to finish the game off. We also have Labor Force. This is a 3-cost fast speed card. There's class bonus costing 1 less, so it's going to cost us 2 as long as we've gone up to Sylvia already. And target ally gets +1 health until end of turn. And if the ally is an animal or beast, put a buff counter on it. So with all of our units being animals in this deck, we're always going to get that buff counter, and it's effectively going to be a +2 to the health for the turn, allowing us to not only save that Raccoon from probably dying from the 2 or 3 attack that the opponent's most likely going to be doing with it, but also it's going to be then giving that permanent buff, making most Shield Raccoons becoming 2-3s, which is the good stat line to have, or even Bedivere becoming a 2-5, Portly becoming a 3-4 permanently. Just a great card to be able to play in any situation or to save a unit and swing the tide of the game. We then have Radiant of Origin Tamer. Now, this is one of those cards you probably don't need in this deck. I want to play some of the new cards, and this is a great fun thing to have. Of course, quite often you can be Sylvie level 1 for a little while while you're building up your board, swinging and doing chip damage to your opponent while you remove everything from the graveyard. So this has the whenever you declare an attack with a non-human ally, put a training counter on this. Now, all our Raccoons being non-human means every time you swing with a Raccoon, you're going to get a counter on this. Then has pay 3 and sacrifice it, level up your champion. Activate this ability only if there are 7 or more training counters on this. So quite often this deck, that's only going to take you 2-3 turns in order to get the counters on this required in order to level up. So if you are worried about losing that 2 influence in order to bring Ellen out, you can quite easily sacrifice this on the end of your opponent's turn, level up into Ellen, and then go into your turn ready with a 4 level unit, not only giving you the Bedivere, but also then enabling things like the Primal Whip if you haven't had time to bring Beastborn Ears out. It is also a good thing to note that because Radiant of Origin Tamer is a fast speed activation thing, you can just leave it sitting here, waiting for your opponent to go for the kill on Bedivere. Then in response to them trying to kill Bedivere, or even in response to the on-death trigger, you can pay the 3 for the Radiant of Origin Tamer, sacrifice it, bring out Ellen, then hopefully if you've got a couple other animals on the board, you'll get that +2 level, becoming level 4, giving you that Bedivere trigger in order to get buff counters on everything else where your opponent might not have realized that was possible. We then have Song of Nurturing. Allies you control get +2 until end of turn. Has a class bonus of those allies get +1 until end of turn. Quite often this is going to be a defensive card that you play, in order to just protect your units if your opponent's going for a massive cleave, or if they're just trying to pick off different units with different spells. However, it can also be used in the opposite as a 2-drop +1 damage for all your units. So if you have 4 or 5 Raccoons on the board, that's 4 or 5 extra damage for 2. It's a pretty good stat line in order to finish out a game. We then have 3 copies of Staggering Strike. You might be thinking, what is this doing in a Raccoon deck? Well, one of the things with this is I do want the deck to sort of be playable at locals. I want you to have fun, but I also want you to be able to deal with those Cheshire Cats and Dream Furies and the likes that might be causing you some problems. So Staggering Strike is a great card to have in the deck because a lot of the True Sight Norm allies are only 2 attack units, so you require a Forest Cake or something in order to give it that buff in order to then try and remove those units. So it becomes a little bit inconsistent in terms of having to have multiple cards in order to set it up. So Staggering Strike becomes a good option, being in the 3 cost of 3 attack in order to remove any of them. It also has the on champion hit of remove 3 preparation counters from the hit champion. Isn't going to come into effect too often, maybe if you're versing a Tristan or a Luxemzander or something like that, where they care about their prep counters a little bit, then it might become a good tech piece for them as well. The main thing of this is as well, is that once you've paid 3 in attack with this, you can also then pay 1 and play a Aspiring Cool to give buffs to your other units on the board as well. Moving on to the sideboard with Beast Bomb Paws. Now, as we mentioned, we've got all 3 baubles on the main board, so I just wanted a couple generic good options to bring into the deck to replace the 2 baubles that you don't need. So Beast Bomb Paws being a 0-drop Regalia that gives True Sight to a unit as well as +1 is just a great option in this deck. Of course, it does have to target an animal or beast, but with every unit in this deck being an animal, of course, we are going to be fine there. So it's just a generic good Regalia that if your opponent plays something like Banish the Sight to give them stealth, being able to bring this out and give something True Sight to get an extra trip damage through that your opponent might not have expected, it's always just a good thing to have. We then also have Clockwork Music Box for Regalia. This is a 0-drop that comes in hindered, so it enters rested. It has the class bonus effect of whenever you activate a Harmony or Melody card from your hand, banish it as it resolves, and then you can tap this, activate a card banished by Clockwork Music Box. So the only options in this deck for this are going to be Blissful Cooling with being a melody, and Song of Nurturing with being a melody as well. So most of the time you're probably going to want to be doing the Blissful Coolings with this, because it effectively turns this one card into 2 activations of look at the top 5 and put an animal or beast from among them into your hand. So it allows you to dig deeper, go positive on cards, and effectively just ends up in a situation where you're just gaining extra value. This is one of those cards that you could possibly have main board as well. Just if you knew you weren't going to run into one of the elements, I'd take out one of the baubles for this. However, I just wanted to make the main board as consistent as possible for as wide a range of metas as possible. So I just put this in the sideboard for now, but it probably is one that I'd look at main board if you knew you were going to run into water or wind, say. For the main board options, we've got 3 copies of Brachus Ludus. This is a 1/3 drop norm that if a card with floating memory put into a graveyard, that play banished instead. Of course, we're not running any floating memory at all, so we're not going to have to worry about losing anything to this, but our opponents definitely are, especially if you're able to turn 1 play this down. It can quite often be a real pain for your opponents, especially the turbo players that are trying to get to level 3 fast and play lots of floating memory into their bin. This can completely shut them down. I don't feel like it's good enough to be main board in this deck just because we wanted a lot of that support for the Raccoons and the game plan to stay the same. You generally only want to bring this in if you know the game's going to be a long game and you know you need this little bit of support to help keep the graveyard empty. Expel the Departed. There's still a lot of fractals and such running around, especially with the new fractal waves being out there. So this is a good option to have in the deck, being a fast speed removal or a Fantasia in order to just slow your opponent down and stop them from playing their game plan. Galdus. Now, Galdus is one of the probably best Allen cards you can have. I love it. It's got the Pride 4, of course, so you can't attack with it straight away, but it's a 6-drop for a 5/8. Good luck to your opponent removing that. Has class bonus on enter. Galdus gains your choice of Spell Shroud or Taunt until the beginning of your next turn. Being able to play down a 6-cost 5/8 and then giving it Taunt, so your opponent is then forced to attack it rather than all your Raccoons, effectively protecting your board from attacks for the next turn, is just absolutely insane. I did want to put this main board, however I did feel that it kind of becomes a little bit clunky into a lot of matchups where your opponent's just using spells to remove your Raccoons, or maybe they've got cleave, or you're just not able to get up to Ellen fast enough to make this have an effect on the game state. So, of course, it has a level 3 plus of this costing 2 less to activate. So once you have gone to Ellen, you're going to be able to pay 4 for this, and then have a 5 out on the board that's able to attack immediately, or possibly give it taunt in order to force your opponent to then attack into the following turns. So it's a good option to bring in if you know your opponent's just going to be using attacks to try and move your allies, especially if you're going into another ally deck or the likes, where they're not going to have too many options to remove this. So I just thought it was a good sideboard card in order to give you options for what you want to do in a long game. Moving on to upgrades, we have Crystallized Destiny, Topsy Decree, and Backup Charger. Now, this is a fun deck. It's not meant to be a deck you take to regionals or take to Ascents, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend putting in a lot of money to upgrade this deck. However, these 3 options, Crystallized coming at $12.50, Topsy coming in at $40 each, and Backup Charger coming in at $38.76, with then the required 24 cents for the turbocharger, of course. Definitely options I'd look at putting into the deck, especially if you're looking at playing other decks in the future, as these are all good staples that are going to be played in pretty much any deck that you want to look at running competitively. So if you are wanting to upgrade the deck a bit, I'd recommend probably putting 4 Topsy Degrees main board, and then 2 or 3 Crystallized sideboard just for those big OTK decks to give you some interaction there. And then Backup Chargers a good thing to bring in place of one of the baubles possibly, in order to just guarantee that draw each game, and then give you the additional draw with the turbocharge in the main board. Moving on to the price breakdown, we have the material deck coming at $4.19, the main deck coming in at $42.71, and the sideboard coming in at $5.94. Now, a majority of this deck is actually very cheap, because most of the Raccoons, even though they have been out only for a week or so, have all come down in price pretty heavily. Bandit Gaze Leader is the main one that's still holding a price tag of $2.90 each. However, I do think that's going to come down a little bit, just because it's not seeing a huge amount of play, of course. It's just the fact it's a rare in Radiant Origins, which are all holding a stupid price tag at the moment for no reason, except for the fact that they're hard to get hold of. We then have Radiant Origin Tamer, of course, at $3.46 each. This is definitely one of those cards you could cut if you can't get hold of them, or if you just don't like how it plays. However, it is definitely one of those cards that is a lot cheaper than it could be, just because a lot of the Radiant Origins seem very common to pull out of the boxes, I hate to say. I have opened quite a bit, so it just feels like it's one of the more common ones to pull. However, there is definitely a lot of super rares that are going up in price in this set. Staggering Strikes, $3.66. Definitely a lot cheaper than it used to be. I'd definitely pick up some Staggering Strikes if you can now, just because it's definitely one of those cards that's going to have a lot of impact going into the future, and I definitely want to have a playset in my collection if I could. We also have the Clockwork Music Box at $1.49. It's definitely one of the cheaper super rares from the older sets. However, it is definitely one of those ones that could start creeping up a little bit as it becomes a little bit harder to get a hold of, and also as we see a lot more melody and harmonies get printed that can synergize with it very well. Of course, back at the material deck now, we've got Local Trinket at $2.32. It's still cheap. It's the perfect Regalia for Raccoons. It is a rare as well, a little bit harder to get a hold of, especially the Regalia rares. I think it is Void Cloak is the Regalia which I have only pulled, I believe it's 2 of, in coming up 4 and a bit cases. So yeah, I'd definitely start picking up those cheaper Regalia if you can, just because it's going to prove hard to find if they start becoming meta relevant. All up though, this brings our total to $52.84. So a little bit over the $50 mark, but not by much. And it's definitely one of those decks that I wouldn't say is hugely meta relevant, but it is definitely a lot of fun to play. And especially if you come up against something like Gembu, you can often have your opponent pulling their hair out. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know down below some other deck ideas you want me to try out. Until next time, stay safe.